The government right now is within reach of a second successive budget surplus. It'll be a feather in the cap for the Albanese government and also Treasurer Jim Chalmers, as it will take away a point of opposition and from the opposition that it only can manage the economy responsibly. The improvement in the budget, well, that's based around a few things. The strong employment figures bring in extra tax from PAYG workers. The government's debt is less than expected, so that means less interest paid. The strongest rate of immigration since 1952, almost 550,000 net migrants last year. That increases the tax take as well. And there's wages inflation, which pushes workers into higher tax brackets and means more money for the government and the budget. But there's something else. The government's correctly arming the tax office with as many tools as it can to ensure that multinational companies pay a higher proportion of the revenue they generate here as tax. For too long, foreign companies have used Australia and its consumers as large and convenient markets. Our comparatively high corporate tax rates have been too easily avoided. Too much money for too long left Australia via often artificially inflated dividends, interest payments, royalties, licence fees or franchising costs. But things, finally, are changing. Last year, compliance efforts secured an extra $6.4 billion in tax revenue from large corporations and multinationals, a record windfall from the ATO's Tax Avoidance Taskforce. Since 2016, it's helped secure more than $27.7 billion in extra revenue. The tax office, though, it's not finished. It's got new powers that will net even more. And today we show you one example. PepsiCo products are used by people more than 1 billion times a day. Last year, its global revenue was $91 billion. But the US maker of such famous brands as Pepsi, Gatorade, Doritos, SodaStream, and here, Smith's Crisps and Twisties is now appealing a landmark tax case that could affect the way that every multinational company operates in this country and is taxed into the future. The government's diverted profits tax, yep, the very same tax that was famously leaked by PricewaterhouseCoopers' former senior tax partner Peter John Collins, well, it's now gaining legal teeth. For the very first time since it was introduced in 2017, late last year the federal court weighed the power of the diverted profits tax. The case pitted the Australian Tax Office against the world's second biggest food and beverage company, PepsiCo.
In addition to the diverted profits tax, the court in Pepsi determined that withholding tax was payable on this arrangement in any event. So the ATO had two arguments and would have been successful on either one. So it has a strong position for other matters going forward.
Spoiler alert, the tax office won the case. PepsiCo is now appealing to the full bench of the federal court.
Out to 12 pounds, someone else. Nothing can beat the PEPSI.
Simply irresistible.
The $224 billion US behemoth is the owner of some of the world's most recognisable consumer brands. At the heart of this case is the way that PepsiCo was paid for its syrup, the not-so-secret formula of high fructose corn syrup, caramel flavouring, of caffeine, citric acid, sugar of course, and carbonated water. And how much of this bottle is actually a royalty for intellectual property and for the Pepsi brand itself, and therefore how much tax should have been withheld. Pepsi doesn't make soft drinks in Australia. It has a deal with Schweppes, which in turn is owned by Japanese brewer Asahi. Pepsi US and its subsidiary Stokely Van Camp, the original owner of Gatorade, did a deal with Schweppes to sell and bottle in Australia. But when it came to the all-important Pepsi syrup, it was made in Singapore, then sold to a company called Pepsi AUS, and then to Schweppes. Most crucial, the deal, according to the contract, was royalty-free. The court had to decide whether Schweppes merely bought Pepsi's syrup or whether, ingrained in the deal, was intellectual property on which royalties should have been paid and tax withheld. Embedded royalties, they're called. One thing from my point of view that I don't quite grasp is if it's an expense going to Pepsi, what's the difference if the expense is for the product? or if it's for the royalty, it's still an expense.
That's right, but Australia has withholding tax on royalties, interest and dividends that are paid out of Australia. So where you have a royalty that's paid from Australia across the border, essentially, then Australia levies royalty withholding tax.
The Commissioner ran his case as alternatives. So his starting point was that there was an embedded royalty and that ought to have been subject to royalty withholding tax. But then his backup argument was that if the arrangement escaped royalty withholding tax, then he would come over the top with the diverted profits tax.
They didn't really consider diverted profits tax, but they said it would apply. And I think that that's going to be the really interesting area, because there's a lot more money in it for the ATO.
But in this case, it's not about the money. It's about establishing case law to chase the bigger money in the future.
We're not talking about big dollars in each case, but when you apply it across the whole economy, I mean, we're talking about a large number of companies that could potentially be affected. And so we're talking about a large pool of funds that the ATO is going to absolutely go after.
Justice Mashinsky ultimately decides at the end of his judgment that the contract between Schweppes and Pepsi in the US is contrived, in that the payments that were ostensibly just for the concentrate were actually in substance payments for concentrate and the valuable IP.
But Justice Mark Mashinsky's decision, which, as we say, is set for appeal, has big ramifications for any company that imports goods into Australia, adds value to them, then markets the finished product under the original company brand name.
So businesses that are in areas such as technology, pharmaceutical companies and retail, they're the ones that have really strong brands that have a lot of IP, and they're the ones that need to be looking closely at their arrangements.
Well, look, the decision itself will be sector agnostic, but it'll clearly potentially apply to large technology companies, use of software, pharmaceuticals, life sciences, consumer brands. It's very, very broad.
This is going to be another way that the ATO goes after those big tech companies, because they've been firmly in the ATO's sights for a number of years now, and they've used a number of different tools to go after them.
And the tax office is wasting no time using this decision to make tax assessments against other multinational companies.
Coca-Cola is widely publicised as being another example of a company with a similar product to Pepsi that is also in its dealings with the ATO at the moment in the courts.
Arnold Bloch-Liebler has reported Coke has been hit with a diverted profits tax assessment for the 2018 and 2019 tax years for $173.8 million. Coca-Cola has already filed an objection to that assessment. Like Pepsi, it seems to be headed for the courts.
I think that it really is, as you say, the thin edge of the wedge, because it applies to so many multinational companies that are operating in Australia.
And there's a sting in the tail of this complex tax case. The diverted profits tax is retrospective. The tax office can go back as far as it likes and look at multinationals' profit-sharing arrangements in the past.
Well, they absolutely all should be looking at their arrangements. And the reason for that is that although these diverted profits tax laws were introduced in 2017, they can apply to arrangements that have been in place prior to that time as well. So they operate going forward, but also to existing arrangements.